Hi, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to tonight's event, a conversation with Professor Khalil Gibran Muhammad, Professor of History, Race and Public Policy at Harvard University's Kennedy School. Our guest will be zoomed in from the US East Coast for this event, and we greatly appreciate his commitment to us, the partnering organizations of this evening, the Munich Documentation Centre for the History of National Socialism, to whose director, Miriam Tadov, I will hand over in a minute, and the Bavarian American Academy. My name is Heike Paul, and as director of the BAA, I have the pleasure to greet all of you, near and far, who have come to listen. It is wonderful to be able to connect again live with an audience that shares the concerns of our public institution. The Bavarian American Academy is an organization that provides a platform for research and exchange among scholars dedicated to the study of American society and culture. We are located, once again, as of this month, in the amerikahaus in Munich, and soon we will reopen our doors. I welcome you to visit and to check out our program online. The board of the BAA has recently issued a statement of solidarity speaking to the current moment of crisis and protest. And we invite all our members and guests to engage with us in educational and scholarly projects that study and address racialized violence in the United States and elsewhere, including our own fields and institutions. Thank you, Professor Muhammad, for joining us in a week that has seen yet more deaths inflicted by COVID-19, as well as by the effects of systemic racism. As the protests continue alongside renewed demands for reform and anti-racist policies, we appreciate you taking the time to be with us as a scholar and as a public intellectual. Thank you, Miriam Tadov, for chairing the event, which is part of the impressive program of the Digital Assembly at the NS Documentation Centre, about which I believe you will have more to say. And so, without further ado, I will let you have the floor. Thank you again and enjoy the evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Heike Paul, for your wonderful welcome remarks. It is my pleasure to chair this event, to talk to Khalil Muhammad, and it's also my pleasure to make this the opening event as a collaboration with the amerikahaus and the Bavarian Amerika-Akademie of our Digital Assembly, as Heike has already mentioned. This is a program that we had actually planned for a real assembly. We wanted to get people together to talk about the issues that we are concerned about, the value of democracy, the questions, what we have learned from history, what historical myth we're dealing with, we're working with. But unfortunately, because of the current crisis, we could not have this assembly in front of the NS Documentation Centre in Munich. So we went, as many others, digital and started a series of broadcasts that are being aired starting with today and with events like this one. And I'm very happy, Khalil, that you are here with us today, that you agreed to be here, that you made the time, because it's a very busy time for a scholar of race and public policy in the United States, and especially one who is such a renowned scholar and has an expertise in a field that is really in the center of the discussion right now. Your book, or one of your many publications, but the book that is being quoted now over and over again is The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America, a study which has been quoted last week in John Oliver's Late Night Show, and which deals with many of the questions that are part of the protests right now. Before we start, I just want to tell everybody here in the room with us that you are very welcome to ask questions, especially on the YouTube chat. You have to be, I think you have to be somehow logged into YouTube in order to being able to do so, but I think it shouldn't be very difficult. And there will be time for questions after our conversation, and we're welcome to addressing them. Khalil, you've briefly mentioned it before when we first talked about this event tonight. It was about 3 weeks ago. It was right before the George Floyd protests started. The intention was to talk about the fact that the corona virus is not only a biological virus, but especially in the US, it appears to be a social one, a disease that affects Black communities disproportionately, a disease that exposes the weaknesses of the American democracy and American society. Much has happened in the past 3 weeks, many discussions have started. As you know, you being an expert on the history of racism and of questions of crime and punishment in the context of systemic racism, you were involved in many public debates in the past weeks. So I just want to start with a sort of rather overall question. How did you experience these weeks as a professional, but also, you know, personally?
Well, it's been really hard, Miriam. Let me also just acknowledge that I appreciate being invited back to the Bavarian Academy, to the amerikahaus, to have this conversation about what's happening in the United States. And that being said, it's been exhausting because as you know, and those who attended my talk in October when I spoke there, that you don't have to be a rocket science to see that our society has a core feature of it that ensures various forms of racial inequality. And that sometimes that form takes a most pernicious turn for the worse that actually creates levels of death and suffering that just are really morally abhorrent. And then other times become flashpoints in the way that the killing of George Floyd layered on top of other kinds of police action or inaction, and we can talk a little bit about what the inaction part looks like, has created, not for the first time, a crisis of legitimacy for American democracy. And of course, putting this on top of a president who has demonstrable support from white nationalists and white supremacists and neo-Nazis in the United States of America, it all feels like it's too much. And so the last 3 weeks have in many ways been the most exhausting, but on the other side, a lot of inspiration has come out of seeing, maybe for the first time in 50 years, an outpouring of support and commitment and courage, not just by members of the African American community or Black diasporic communities here in the States, but also a lot of white Americans who are willing to say enough is enough.
And that was exactly the question I wanted to ask you. In what ways are these protests different? They're different because they're different people on the streets, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, we don't have to look for complexity when it's not that hard to figure out. It matters that we are seeing protests led by the face of a young white American population. All of these people, of course, are not young, but many of them are. And many of them also in an international context, your residents of Germany and Munich and other parts of Europe would recognize a lot of these kids are climate change activists. Kids who have been involved in leaving school on Friday, inspired by Greta Thunberg's calls for political elites to finally pay attention to what this generation needs for themselves and for the future. So it's the mashup of the intersections of various youth activity and movements. There's, of course, the core base of movement activity that often is called Black Lives Matter, which is almost a decade old, going back to 2012 in the United States, on top of young activists. And then the last thing I'd say about like the scale of white participation is that the diversity within it is also striking. It is both the young people I just talked about, but it's also 30-somethings, 40-somethings who are, as one community activist told me in Minneapolis, in the neighborhood where George Floyd was killed, he said, "Man, the gentrifiers are out here too." and by that he means the very people who have in some ways created the conditions of displacement for low-income African Americans, have often been the first to call the police over nuisance things like my neighbor's playing their noise too loud, or why are they talking on the front stoop? They should be in their apartments. These kinds of tensions that flare up in the United States over the movement of white affluent people into these neighborhoods. Those folks in many ways are also recognizing that these are their communities too. And if their neighbors, despite these tensions, can be shot or killed in plain daylight, then something must really be wrong with the nature of policing.
Yes, that is exactly the feeling that one gets also looking at what is going on in the US from here. I remember, I think it must have been at the start of the protest, the infamous Amy Cooper video of a white woman calling the police after she's been asked to put her dog on a leash by a black bird watcher, and it kind of exposed this absurd parallel world that is out there, and that usually is not being live streamed, it's not being put on Twitter, and it's not being seen by millions of people. But suddenly, and this was also the digital aspect of these protests, suddenly people were seeing all the things that happened, and became in many ways witnesses of crimes, of injustice, or of racism, and were put in a different situation, I think, in some ways, and also the fact, as you've mentioned, that the protests swept over the Atlantic to Europe. There was a demonstration here in Munich with 25,000 people. And partly, I agree, they might have been climate change activists who finally got out of their homes again. But it also, I think, created a shift with the climate change movement that has become much more political and aware of the fact that there is a social dimension to climate change and also social responsibility. So that I think were some of the really interesting changes that we've seen. I just want to ask, I want to ask you sort of as a next step a little bit about your book, because your book has become so central right now, because you were documenting 400 years of injustice towards Black Americans, and sort of creating or bridging the history between slavery and today's police activities, and things like the war against drugs in the 1990s that targeted Black Americans, and many other aspects of American history that haven't been put together before. So what is the kind of like, it's been 400 years and much has changed, but lots of things haven't changed.
Yeah, so a couple of things just to highlight, because it's a long history and it's also complicated, but there are a couple of things that are important to highlight. One, Americans themselves, in learning their own history, have admitted to structural racism, but mostly described it as the fault of Southerners. And so there's a way in which blaming racism in America on the past, and the Southern past in particular, lets everyone else off the hook. Also, because the South and that the Southern past happened before the 1960s, as many people say, it also feels like it doesn't explain a lot of what's going on in the present to many white Americans. So that's part of the problem. We don't understand that racism was not just a Southern problem. It was all of America's problem, and that it lasted longer than the South, and it happened and flourished in northern cities. It's one of the reasons why Amy Cooper is such a crystal clear example, because at the moment when Amy Cooper decided that she would make a false report against a man who was a member of the Audubon Society, for crying out loud. I mean, a Black man who was challenging her to put her dog on the leash so that she could follow the rules. And she said, I'm going to call and tell them that I'm being threatened. Oh, no, she did call and say that I'm being threatened by a dangerous Black man. She was employing the same logic that white Southern women and their white male counterparts often used to challenge Black people when they stepped out of their place. So a white woman would say, this person put his hand on me, this person touched me, this person whistled at me. For your members of this broadcast who heard the name Emmett Till, which is a famous name of a 15-year-old boy lynched in Monee, Mississippi in 1955, which in many ways set off the civil rights movement and brought a lot of people into activity then. That's the same old thing. And so she is a self-described liberal progressive living in New York City. So part of the history that I tell is a history of places like New York City, like Chicago. Part of the history I tell is about liberals and their own version of racism that looks different than in the South, but is no less pernicious. Part of it, I'll just end by saying, is a history of Black resistance to state violence, to police brutality, to systems of racism, and the way that Northern liberal elites discounted or dismissed Black resistance and continue to support various forms of segregation and discrimination.
You contributed last year to a most insightful text, or you contributed a most insightful text to the New York Times 1619 project, which was published in commemoration of the arrival of the first slaves to America 400 years ago. And this project was kind of a written memorial, kind of a milestone in memorial culture, or at least it appeared to me like that. I don't know if I read it right, because
I think that's right.
That was how it felt, because many of the researchers were not entirely new, but they were not being read by a broader audience. And it's kind of, we're in this situation now. Stone memorials are being taken down of people that are being condemned for various aspects of their lives that have been overlooked. But I was also wondering what kind of different ways of talking about history we have to find, because this project, it was basically one online and normal publication, but it really changed a lot, didn't it?
Well, it did, because these things have been cumulative. I mean, I'm glad you brought up the 1619 project, because if researchers were attempt to poll or survey the range of, so if you asked a lot of these protesters, particularly the white ones, you said, what have you read in the last 3 years that helps you understand what's happening right now? I guarantee you that some number of them would say, I read the 1619 project. So for anyone listening who thinks that ideas don't matter, history doesn't matter, then you'd be mistaken, because these things do matter. Do they get us to policy change as a direct line? No. And a lot of things that people are inspired by and even to participate in a demonstration aren't always enough. But you're right to raise the 1619 project, because it is part of a growing commitment by a number of journalists and even academics like myself who spend as much time talking to general audiences as I do teaching in my actual classroom or writing for broader publications. The history that needs to be told to help us shape an American democracy that is fairer, more egalitarian, and more just is a history that has yet to be fully read and understood. Note, I didn't say written, because in many ways it has been written, but there will need to be much more commitment to engaging that work by many, many stakeholders. And I'm a huge proponent of making sure that we change what we teach our children in our classrooms, because the story of American exceptionalism that passes as civics in our classrooms is part of what is killing Black and brown people in this country.
That was one of the interesting, on a personal level, for me, interesting experiences when I've been teaching at the history department in Bloomington, where you have been teaching before me.
Mm-hmm.
You were at the history department, right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, you were at the history department. Yeah, so we missed each other there. But you know, the situation in Bloomington, there are very few Black students, and there was usually one in the classroom. They were very exposed in a sort of usually majority white group of students. And I remember discovering as a European coming to this very different kind of setting and learning about American culture slowly, I was very surprised to hear that none of the students I have been teaching had covered the topic of, well, maybe slavery a little bit, but anything beyond slavery about Black history, or also, you know, varieties of different cultures of the United States have not been taught in schools, obviously. The story of the Great Migration, the story of the North, not just the Southern phenomenon, as you said, that was quite striking to me, that it was really not an issue, obviously, in the schools.
Yeah, so this is to me the most important policy terrain to explore coming out of what's happening right now. And I want to offer this as a way of illustrating how urgent it is, and then you can tell me if I have this right. So I've been to the museum that you run on the history of the Nazi Party, and it's an incredible treatment of understanding precisely what happened, the broad social context that made it possible for that movement to flourish. And I've also been to Berlin and studied these things. So here is the American version of this. No history that is fundamentally committed to understanding the atrocities of racism across time. It is the equivalent of Germans saying that only Jews will teach this history and only Jewish students will learn it. And everyone else, it's optional. Now, of course, Germany doesn't have a lot of Jews any longer. And so the lesson of what happened there is a lesson for Germans. Mm-hmm. In America, we are learning more about what Germans did to Jews than we are learning about what Americans did to Americans. And that is it. I mean, it's in plain view. It's simply part of the way in which America has not come to terms with its own past. And so therefore it reproduces some of the very same logics of white supremacy and domination of people of color that were baked in at the very beginning. Mm-hmm. Do I have the analogy right? Because that's certainly what I've taken away from my 3 visits to Germany, and it's what I continue to learn from when I see the work that that Germany has done, because so much of your cultural sector is in fact based on the state, based on the federal government, not based on the private sector.
Yes, exactly. Many of the museums are. And it was interesting to see that, for example, Brian Stevenson, when he talked about what led to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, the lynching memorial in the South, he mentioned the Berlin Holocaust Memorial and what he had learned from this experience. it was interesting to see sometimes in the United States, also when you share with other professors in Jewish history, that here in Germany, students who study Jewish history or the history or become also professionals are mostly non-Jews.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just about identity politics, but it's often about sort of integrating this history into or understanding German history in different terms. Now, I wouldn't say that we've done everything right. There are many things we still have to do, and there are many things that still have to address the German colonial past. Also, racism. This is what brought the people to the streets in the last weeks here in Germany too. But at least there is kind of a blueprint that helps us ask different kinds of questions about about the various histories, but also about the present situation and talk about the future, I think. Yeah.
Just can I make one quick point on this, Miriam?
Course.
So just again, to illustrate the striking contrast, and I've certainly learned some of the shortcomings in areas where, particularly around German colonialism, that we still have a long way to go in Germany. But to make the point, it's not just that we don't teach the history of slavery and with the domination and violence directed towards indigenous populations, or what we did to Chinese immigrants in the early 19th century. The first immigration restriction laws were focused on Chinese immigrants, for example, in the United States. It's that we don't do that, and we've built a memorial culture that is dominated by the Confederacy when it comes to race. There are many more Confederate monuments and museums dedicated to that story than there are to the anti-slavery history or to histories of Black resistance to their domination. So it's a both and. It's what we're not doing, and it's also what is happening. So that's remarkable, because you'd be hard pressed to find post-conflict societies anywhere where the response after the conflict was to build museums and monuments to the people who were on the wrong side of the conflict. But that's what's been happening in the United States for over 100 years, about 125 years.
Yes, yes. I was thinking of something that Viet Thanh Nguyen has been writing, I think in the New York Times. He wrote an article about the situation in right now after COVID or with COVID-19. And he said that this crisis is killing off the myth that America is the greatest country on earth. It was interesting for me as an experience when I lived in the States and planned to stay there also. This kind of the American patriotism, the feeling that you live in the greatest country on earth, whether there are social problems or not. And the country is drowned in flags, and children have to say the Pledge of Allegiance every day in the morning. Somebody born like me, born in Austria, or someone who was born in Germany and grew up in Germany, could never understand that kind of patriotism that you experience in the United States. And I also remembered one of the things that was very impressive for me in a very emotional moment, the day before the Trump election, President Obama gave a speech, and he ended it with the sentence, he kind of said, like, don't worry, the sun will rise tomorrow again over the greatest nation of all. And in that moment, it felt, it sounded more like an incantation or a hope or a wish or a doubt. And now towards the end of this presidency, or hopefully at least, or at least the first term, one worries what happened to the country in the past 3.5 years, to the various institutions, but also what happened before. And with basically with a constitution that was written in a time of racism or of slavery still, and hasn't been rewritten. What kind of myth are we dealing here with?
No, Miriam, I mean, that's a really long stretch of pointing out how both the best of our political class represented by President Obama, who by any stretch of the measure was one of the most thoughtful, intelligent spokespersons for the American project. I mean, on the global stage, I have many policy disagreements with Obama and some stylistic disagreements with Obama, including the example you just gave. And therefore, like, to be able to acknowledge the greatness in Obama, as well as the perniciousness of the myth of American exceptionalism, even before having a conversation about Donald Trump, tells you what we're up against. It really does tell you what we're up against. And I love also that you acknowledge that we have this oldest constitution representing representative democracy. And the notion that we have a strong, tangible commitment, mostly in the Republican Party, but not entirely, to an originalist reading of that document, tells you something about the civic process of even producing our best leaders. Something in the sausage of making citizens in this country produces leadership that fails to reimagine how to move past the flaws and limitations of our founding fathers, as if somehow their genius was otherworldly in a way that we cannot point to their flaws, that we cannot really take full accounting, that they wrapped us into a set of linguistic tropes about liberty and freedom that we can't keep holding on to lest we fail to free ourselves from what they've delivered, which has been an impartial journey of freedom, a liberty that is defined as much as the liberty to oppress another person as it is a liberty to be free of oppression. So there's no question we need a brand new constitution, or we need a series of new amendments, a new Bill of Rights tacked on the back end of our Constitution to catch up, to literally catch up with the rest of the world. There are basic guarantees of human rights in many post-World War II constitutions that Americans from the State Department leadership around the world helped to write, that protect basic dignity and human rights for people that Americans don't actually have. Your prisons, which I have been inside of, protect the basic rights of both native-born Germans and foreign-born residents of those prisons far more, both in law and in practice, than in the greatest country on earth, the United States of America.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you were pointing out this the discrepancy and the tension between what happened within the country and outside of the country. I remember when I lived in the United States, I always read German newspapers that were full of appreciation for America. And I said in the Midwest, and I said to myself, but there's so many things you're overlooking here. It's a great country. That is not the point. But there's so many things that have been forgotten to address, or it felt like that have been, that have been ignored. And then the shock was enormous for many Germans to see what happened underneath. But at the same time, we've as Europeans profited from the strength of the American liberal democracy. There are other places who have profited, but especially Germany. Our center is next to the place where the Center of American Re-Education was, which then became the amerikahaus, and the place where Germans after 1945 were re-educated, were learning, German children were learning what is a democracy about, what is liberal democracy about, and came to appreciate America as an amazing country that offers a kind of freedom and lives with, without all the hierarchies that we are experiencing here. And so one of the things I kept thinking a lot about is transatlantic relationships, because, you know, as Germans, we have profited a lot from them. And the question is now, maybe we should renew them on a cultural and academic level in order to kind of really learn from each other's experiences, narratives, and also the things we've missed on the way on both sides. I'm not saying that we're doing so much better and we should teach the rest of the world. That is not the point, but I think there should be some sort of mutual exchange in that sense, especially when it comes to democracy, which is threatened in so many places right now.
Yeah. Well, listen, I mean, I'm far be it for me to point out how wonderful Chancellor Merkel is relative to how Germans themselves might be thinking about the limitations and complexities of her leadership. But certainly from afar, and going back to the Syrian refugee crisis, even before Brexit and Donald Trump were elected, she did look to people like me from across the pond as someone who was modeling the best of what America claims when it describes itself as a nation of immigrants. As a place that has long been a beacon for people who were throwing off the chains of authoritarianism in other parts of the globe and could find their way here. I do think there's something to be said about the fact that we've painted ourselves into a very dark corner, of which Trump is just a symptom and an expression of. Antonin Scalia, who for years was a standard bearer of a conservative jurisprudence, one of the originalists I referred to in the Supreme Court, used to be fond of saying that the rest of the world may no longer be executing people with mental disabilities or young people, but we don't follow the rest of the world. The rest of the world follows us. And so even the notion of, if the United Nations issues resolutions condemning various forms of state violence in other parts of the globe, or poverty rates, or failures of government or good government, when they rub up against America's national interest, we balk. We say we're not governed by the United Nations. So there's tremendous hypocrisy baked into the American state. And again, it's been accelerated under Donald Trump, but it didn't start with him. And so I do think you're right. We should be people who have the opportunity either to teach future policymakers or elected officials, or to advise them, all to be pushing. One of the things I noticed when I visited your museum and learned more about the American Academy's origins, the amerikahaus, is I kept thinking about the images of white women coming to Germany to teach German children about liberal democracy, providing reading lists on America and how great it is. So I haven't looked at the bibliography, but one imagines Mark Twain being part of that, or Ralph Waldo Emerson, or Henry David Thoreau, or these canons of American writers. And then I kept thinking, like, I wonder if they taught Martin Luther King's work in the midst of the civil rights movement. I wonder if they ever mentioned James Baldwin to Germans. I wonder if they ever showed images of angry white Southerners as young children were trying to integrate schools in Little Rock, Arkansas, or New Orleans, or other parts of the South. My guess would be no, because that was an image of America that was not one that America on the foreign stage was willing to celebrate. And so that, to me, is the unfinished work. Can America finally come to terms with the way that it has tried to project an image abroad of a liberal democracy, a beacon of freedom and opportunity for all, versus the way that it is profited from the exploitation and domination of its own citizens of color?
Martin Luther King was definitely talked about here. He was definitely an issue, since you referred to that, but James Baldwin much less. Sort of the whole story of, you know, the anger, the rage, the justified anger, the disappointment would not be addressed, not on a large scale, I think. And I think it was really important that there were, you know, that there's at least more and more movies, that there is a certain public space being more and more inhabited by Black Americans, you know, at least on a sort of growing scale that helps understand in a different way. Spike Lee, of course, played a big role. We have Arthur Jaffa's work in our museum right now. But I think the level of inequality, the level of violence is something that hasn't been addressed for a long time, and only recently, and strangely thanks to Trump, I want to say, because he really has exposed the situation as it is right now, and kind of like brought it to the extreme.
Yes.
Yeah.
To say the least.
To say the least, yes. The situation of, you know, with the COVID-19 crisis has exposed, of course, the fact that this administration is completely incapable of almost everything that was handled or mishandled in this crisis. But one of the things that it really exposed is the inequality in American society, the inequality of wealth, which creates an inequality of health. One of the questions that I'm having is, you know, American capitalism plays a major role in all this. You have worked on that as well. American capitalism is the base for the structural racism, and structural racism is the base for American capitalism. Is this a key factor for a further development? When we go on from the protests, something has to be, we have to leave this vicious circle somehow. So where are we heading? What is, you know, what are the opportunities? What are the things we need to address? Like, for example, during the height of the crisis, New York forbid evictions of tenants, and these usually evictions, usually are a problem for Black Americans or people of color who are renting. And today it was announced that New York City will freeze rents for a year for 2.3 million residents who live in rent-regulated apartments. But this seems just a little, you know, a very, very, very a tiny step in you know, making things better. It obviously isn't enough.
Yeah, so a lot of very courageous proposals are now entering into legislative debate and producing some changes. The interesting thing about the recent New York City rent freeze is that people who self-identify either as socialist or anti-capitalist reformers have been really, since the pandemic started, saying that the need to push forward ideas that would fundamentally change the very structure of our global economy, and most especially the United States as the wealthiest nation in the world, we need to have what are called shovel-ready ideas, because as Naomi Klein has written extensively, the disaster capitalists will surely be pushing their ideas forward. What does she mean by that? That essentially, by virtue of man-made or natural disaster, when it seems that emergency measures must be taken to save lives or solve a problem, all of a sudden, unions no longer in the education sector matter any longer because they're too expensive, and now's the time to start over. So the version of that that's happening in the United States right now, learning from the way that often conservative or right-leaning, often wealthy policy generators took advantage of prior disasters, are now saying, yes, now's the time to abolish or defund the police, precisely because the conditions are ripe for putting shovel-ready ideas before the public to say, see, this is where we need to go. And I think your point about the intersections of capitalism and racism, or what many of us, including myself, would call racial capitalism, are borne out in this pandemic in a way that perhaps has not ever really been articulated in quite as stark a set of terms as possible. So one way to understand this is, I'm going to borrow the term of a colleague of mine, Ruth Gilmore. She says that the problem of late stage capitalism is the problem of organized abandonment and organized violence. The organized abandonment is the actual structural divestment in communities that are not meant to thrive. They're only meant to exist in a context where whatever can be extracted from them will be. Their labor primarily, or even a form of popular entertainment. But everything else is no longer worthy of investment. The organized violence becomes the instrument of maintaining the organized abandonment, policing, prisons, other forms of carceral surveillance and control. So it's clear that the United States is the wealthiest country precisely because of the history and present of extraction, alongside, wait for it, the country that has the most punitive state apparatus the world has ever known. Those two things are not actually in tension. They are not in contradiction. They are doing what they're supposed to do. Extract as much wealth for a small group of people as possible and use the instruments of state violence to control the population who might otherwise rebel. So the future of this will begin to pursue abolitionist arguments. What are abolitionist arguments? The retreat away from organized abandonment and organized violence, to abolish the punitive instruments of controlling the fundamental extraction and exploitation of people who have been subject to divestment and abandon. Therefore, you put back in place the very things that people need to survive: healthy, structured living, opportunities, and actual public goods that will expand health, public hospitals, K through 12 education that works and that is fully resourced, living wage jobs, family paid, affordable housing, including in a time like this, freezing rent. I mean, it's not rocket science to go down the list of things that the public goods that people lack and want for, which is also true in many European countries, as debates in France with yellow jacket protesters have illustrated. That's the crisis that we face now and the possibility for transformation going forward.
Yeah, countries like Spain, because there has been much talk also in Europe, for example, about the basic income, like Finland has introduced, and Spain has actually realized it as part of this crisis. And seen it as or answered these demands in a very productive way. But we've seen it in Germany, of course, that the welfare state really helped shoulder the crisis. The crisis wasn't, of course, as bad as in the United States, but the lockdown was long. But many people were helped by the state or supported by a system that is built to give this basic structure. So one of the things you've mentioned, and one of the things that is being discussed now a lot, is defunding the police. And I think you've written an article about it, or in an interview, you had many good sort of arguments and productive solutions of what could be done. Because one of the issues, I think, is that the police in the United States was taking on the one hand, taking on jobs that are not supposed to be done by the police, but that are supposed to be done, for example, by social workers, or that are supposed to be done by all parts of society that are not being funded. But on the other hand, the police is sometimes sort of not acting where it is needed. And I wonder what ideas you would have about this discussion of defunding the police.
Yeah, so there's one part of this that I think is always important in a conversation like this to mention, which is that defunding the police is born out of decades of abolitionist organizing and thinking. So we're having the moment where that conversation has moved from the margins of movement work to mainstream national conversation, and that's a good thing. The other thing is that defund, like abolitionist arguments about police, is both a process and an outcome. And it's easy to just get to the outcome. Well, what is it that these people want? What is it that they think is going to work that hasn't worked in the past? But the process itself is about reestablishing a social contract between the state and its citizens, of which policing has been a primary instrument of indoctrinating Black Americans and other poor Americans of color into what their citizenship actually looks like, or what the limits of their citizenship is. So the process means that those movement leaders who have been in the trenches working out the ideas that would reflect a different kind of reality and citizenship need to be at the table. Rather than avoiding them because they're all wild-eyed, crazy people who nobody wants to talk to, which is the nature of how reform generally works, they need to be at the table alongside traditional stakeholders in community, from small business owners to church and clergy, et cetera, along with elected officials. And out of that conversation, a new first principles, basic understanding that the police and its unions don't get to tell the citizens what kind of policing they're going to do, what kind of policing they deserve. That's not liberal democracy. And it's only a version of liberal democracy that concentrates power within one class of citizens, i.e. generally white, and more particularly concentrates political power in a group of white affluent Americans. And so when the people who are most in need of a different kind of policing are systematically left out of the conversation and are the least powerful in affecting what change needs to happen, then you get more of the same. So defund means we start with a process that centers the people who are most proximate to the problem and who have spent time working out the solutions, and therefore have the most legitimacy in our liberal democracy for shaping the outcomes. Just to mention these outcomes that I'm hearing and that I'm part of in some other context of work that I do, let's start at the deep end of the pool. The deep end of the pool is actually the part of the pool that does the most damage. In the United States of America, according to the Vera Institute of Justice, which is an organization that I'm on the board of, 10.5 million arrests happen in this country annually, and only 5% are for violence. So that means that 10 million arrests in this country are happening in the United States that are focused primarily on things that are not even the worst of the worst that human beings can do to each other. What are those things are? Overwhelmingly traffic violations, and then summonses and fines for various kinds of no criminal activity, really, people who are violating municipal ordinances, loud music, walking in the middle of the street, riding a bicycle, public intoxication, this sort of thing. The vast majority of arrest activity and police activity are for low-level offenses that have very little to do with the justification for heavy-handed, proactive, we're going to get the bad guys kind of policing. It's also true that the United States since the 1980s has focused a lot on putting police officers in schools where there was violence, but the response to that was not to bring in more guidance counselors who could talk to children who needed someone to talk to say why they were feeling vulnerable, why they wanted to hurt someone, why they had a grievance with a teacher or with a fellow student. Instead, they put in metal detectors, often in Black urban schools, and hired more police, often outsourcing actual municipal police officers. This doesn't make any sense because the children who are crying out for help, who may resort to violence in order to resolve that help, can't be helped by a person whose only instrument is corporal punishment or arrest. That's it. That's all police officers generally can do and do well. So from nuisance calls for too loud of music on your neighbor to schools and the need to police children because they might want to hurt each other, to calling police for mental health problems or people who literally need assistance rather than need to be arrested or in this case put down because they pose a threat to the law enforcement officer. All those things are on the table. The last thing I'll say about this very quickly is that There are people called violence interrupters who are community-based public health workers who do a very good job, often far better than law enforcement, in doing conflict resolution in communities that experience a lot of violence. Why? Because the truth is, the secret in America that most police agencies won't admit to is most people don't want to kill anybody. And so people who actually are armed, who illegally carry weapons, feel a sense of insecurity that they know they can't count on anyone else to protect them from it. So they carry a gun to preempt their own death if in fact someone gets mad at them and pulls a gun out. So it's kind of a vicious cycle. Yeah. These people actually like working with community-based public health workers. They like being able to go to someone and say, look, I think someone's going to hurt me. Can you help on my behalf? That person who's the violence interrupter goes and talks to the potential aggressor. They have a conversation and nobody gets hurt. And this has been happening in 20 or more cities for 20 years. And it's underfunded because police officers don't really like ceding to public health workers the responsibility of helping solve violence. But now with the defund movement happening, hopefully a lot more of that will go forward and people will in fact open their minds to a different way of delivering safety, even in the midst of violence.
Mm-hmm. And it's all about the knowledge about these kinds of things. And I remember in the past weeks or even before that, watching videos on Twitter or other social media platforms, with the small kids, 7, 8-year-old Black kids taken from schools because there was some issue at the school by a police officer being brought to some institution without even informing the parents or starting a discussion about it. And the parents wouldn't know about any of this. And this comes, of course, also with the privatization of the prisons and the prison system, which then becomes a major factor in racial capitalism. I remember it was part of the New York Times 1619 project, an article on the Angola prison, which for me was one of the most shocking informations I had read in a while. Basically, mainly Black prisoners being forced to handpick cotton as part of their prison sentence as a, cynical form of remembering or keeping the logics of slavery alive and the ideas of slavery alive. That was something I still couldn't. I still can't grasp it.
Yeah, it's hard to grasp, but it is exactly how things have worked in this country for a long time.
Yeah. Well, much has been said about whether we will go back to an old normal after this COVID-19 crisis, or whether there is no return to that old normal, and we need some sort of rebalancing in terms of how we live our lives, how we what kind of sort of capitalist systems we need. What kind of markets we want. And so one of the questions, or my last question actually is, what are you, if you think about the second half of this year with the upcoming election, are you more hopeful, or are you more worried about what we're facing?
Yeah. So I am hopeful, in the sense that I think that what we call people power will have far more influence on the debate that will take place between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, but also maybe even more productively about the debate that the Democratic Party is going to have in order to have any kind of legitimacy as the governing political party if in fact Biden should win the election. Because up until the Floyd protests and the pandemic, it was clear that the Democratic Party was rallying around Joe Biden, whose record, both in terms of all the things we've talked about, is a very poor reflection of changing for the better. He had a key role and pushing back against integration in the 1970s with regard to busing Black children or white children into integrated schools. He was a lead sponsor of the crime bill that built the biggest prison system the world has ever known. And while he takes a lot of credit for being Obama's vice president, that he doesn't have neither he nor Obama have a very strong record of significant policy work around dealing with systemic racism. And so what the people power has shown us is that when people exercise their people power, a lot of things are possible. And so I'm hopeful that those folks will continue to demonstrate and protest, will continue to put pressure on political elites in this country, especially on the Democratic Party side. But also, I think Mitch McConnell, our head of the Senate and the high chamber of the US Congress, is feeling a lot of that pressure from within his party. And I wouldn't have said that to you 4 weeks ago. So that's what makes me hopeful.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I would like to open the floor for questions, and I hope that I do understand how this works now. I should see if there is someone asking a question, I should see it in the chat. So everybody, you're very welcome to put your comments, your questions on the YouTube chat, and let us know what you think. Let's see. Okay. So there is a first question here that says, do you expect major changes if Joe Biden hopefully wins the election?
I do expect changes, but most especially in foreign policy. So, the State Department will get lots of people that have not lost their jobs or disappeared and not been replaced. That's just, low-hanging fruit. But I think to the bigger question, yes, there will be changes. Will they be enough? That remains to be seen based on the issues that we've talked about. I think that Vice President Biden's VP choice will tell us a lot about how much the White House under Biden will lead these changes rather than follow them. Those are two different things. And the degree to which, for example, he chooses an Elizabeth Warren as a very clear progressive member of the progressive part of the Democratic Party, or chooses a Stacey Abrams, who is both progressive and anti-racist in her leadership experience, or if he goes with a centrist like Amy Klobuchar or Pete Buttigieg, although I guess he's committed to a woman, so that's not likely to happen. Kamala Harris could be a compromise person, or Susan Rice, who look more like the centrist traditions of the Obama administration than someone like Stacey Abrams or Elizabeth Warren. So I think we'll get an early preview of what the Biden presidency will deliver based on the VP choice.
Thank you. We have a follow-up question in the same sort of field. Does the US need an election reform? And I would like to extend this to how could the US have an election reform, and what kind of administration or president would be needed to get rid of the Electoral College?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first of all, this circles back to our earlier conversation about the Constitution. Contrary to popular belief, and it's a hard thing to kind of say, are you really sure about that? Americans don't have a right to vote. What they have is a federal protection granted by the states that their right to vote shall not be abridged based on certain protected categories, i.e. race or sexuality or nationality or religion, et cetera, et cetera. So what essentially is the case is that there is no federal protection for vote. Even in the case of the Voting Rights Act, what the Voting Rights Act, the original one in the 1960s, protected was established essentially that states who had been known to deny people the right to vote based on their race would have to submit the rules of election in advance of any changes that they would make, because they could not be trusted. So the power of the federal government to ensure access to the ballot box for African Americans going from the 1960s to the present until recently when the Supreme Court stripped that law of its enforcement provision was based on the history of evidence that the state was not actually protecting Black people's right or Black people's state granted right to vote. Okay. Mm-hmm. So what would we need? The simplest answer to that question is we would need a constitutional amendment to give the federal government the right to determine how people vote in the United States of America. Therefore, taking back from the states, but states having control over each electoral process. In Georgia, for example, when Stacey Abrams ran against Brian Kemp was the Secretary of State for the state of Georgia. The Secretary of State is responsible for voting procedures, for making sure that the citizens of the state of Georgia have access to the ballot box. Well, Brian Kemp had rigged the rules to favor people living in white communities against African Americans. Why? Because they shut down a number of polling places in Black communities. They shortened the hours that people could vote. They passed voter ID laws, which have a known disproportionate impact on people who don't drive or poorer residents who haven't had real need for licensing, state licensing, et cetera. So in other words, the person who was running for governor was in control of the electoral machinery, refused to step down from that. And empirical estimates are that Stacey Abrams lost that race by a pretty razor-thin margin, precisely because of a lot of Black people being disenfranchised by those rules. This can happen in every state, in every election, depending on who's in charge. So should we keep doing the same thing as a classic definition of insanity? Or should we decide as a nation to pass a constitutional amendment that says the federal government will determine how people have access to the ballot box and will dispense with the political contest between partisans, where we know for a fact the Republican Party wins when fewer people have access to the ballot box, and that the Republican Party, some of its elite members and political strategists have said on the record that we win when fewer Americans vote. So what version of liberal democracy makes sense in any classical sense when the whole idea is to make sure that fewer people have access to the ballot box? That's not going to change until there's a federal law in place to restrict that.
Yeah, but I guess the big question in the coming month will be, since we know that President Trump has been fighting mail ballots already for a couple of months, what will happen, especially if there is a second wave of COVID-19 that could have a serious impact on the election, of course. What is your feeling about the protests? Did they change, or is there considerable change towards voting? Because a lot of people felt that voting wouldn't make a difference in the last elections. Is there a growing awareness of, my vote really counts and makes a difference?
I'm not sure that I've seen any polling data coming out of the protest that asks voters if they are more likely to vote today than they were prior to the pandemic or the protests. I'm not saying those don't exist. I just haven't seen them. And so I can't answer that question from that perspective. What I can say is that having both been inside of conversations amongst movement leaders who are closer to young people who are very cynical about our political class in the United States of America, particularly from the left, that a lot hangs in the balance when it comes to how much Joe Biden will reflect what their issues are. Mm-hmm. And it will not be clear, I think, to most people concerned about voter turnout in the 2020 presidential election until Joe Biden starts to debate or run as a general election candidate, and people can scrutinize what he's saying. He's not off to a good start because of his very explicit rejection of defund and his continued commitment to kind of traditional police reform, he's not off to a good turn. And as a betting person, I would say that will suppress the youthful vote for people who are most committed to racial justice change in this country. Some percentage of them will sit this one out of principle more than anything, if they do not think Joe Biden is serious about change. Some of them will sit out as a kind of, a narco strategist, which is that maybe America has to go down in flames, fully in flames, which means if Trump gets reelected, then America gets the country they deserve in order to build a new one. There are a lot of people who find that absolutely abhorrent and objectionable given the stakes of the damage that Trump can do. But therein lies the choice for Joe Biden and the Democratic Party, because they are not innocent in creating the factors that make that choice very real for people.
Mm-hmm. So there is another question, and I read it to you. It says, how fragile is the state of American democracy, since President Trump seems to appreciate dictators and authoritarian regimes more than democracies?
It's as fragile in terms of the nation itself as it has been since the Civil War. There's no other period since the Civil War when the features, the democratic institutions themselves, including journalism as an extension of our civil society, have been under attack from within, have been fundamentally questioned. There are vocal politicians and right movement leaders, talk show hosts, et cetera, who have said on the record, if we don't save America for white Christians, America will be lost to these other elements in society that will destroy this country. And the only way to protect America from those people is to change the rules in real time in order to save it. So none of this is a secret. It is in plain view. It is very open. Many members of the Trump administration who have come and gone represent this point of view. Trump is attracted to this point of view. And so, yes, there's an existential threat to America's future as a result of what's been happening most explicitly since Trump was elected in 2016.
Yeah, I'm just checking if there's another question. We could take another one, maximum two. I'll just wait and see. Is there, yes, there is something. What do you think needs to happen to keep the momentum of the protests going and keep the pressure for social change going so people don't grow tired?
It's kind of a little bit of a silver lining for the coronavirus. So over 2 million people infected in this country. We haven't even talked about so much of what hasn't worked in a country that is led by a party and a president that simply rejects science. That it's all propaganda, it's a hoax, and only acknowledges the importance of science in light of any political calculation, right? And so Trump's poll numbers are way in the tank right now. His approval rating is the lowest it's ever been, and his opponent is polling far ahead of where Hillary Clinton was this time. So now all of a sudden, he's passing an executive order for police reform, but the I forgot the question. I'm sorry.
It was about whether what it needs to happen, or kind of like to keep the momentum of the protests. Sort of pressure for social change going.
Yeah. So the silver lining, which I was setting up, is that as long as the pandemic is keeping people at home, and to some degree, and that there's the crisis of this moment tied to the failures of this administration, I think people will remain active around these issues, because the confluence of the pandemic of corona and the pandemic of racism are catalyzing so much of the energy that we see in the streets. I do think that once America were to fully open, if in fact the fear of the virus were to be legitimately to subside, then I think there'd just be, as a matter of practicality and logistics, there'd be fewer people in the streets.
Yeah, but this is the paradox of the pandemic. Of course, as I said, we had plans for a program that we called Assembly, and it couldn't happen. But I think there is a different kind of awareness to what democracy actually is and the right to assemble means when you are forced to stay at home, and then kind of like really sort of demand that kind of right and ask yourself what it means, you know, if you have the right to assemble or the possibility to assemble, or if you don't have it, because practically with the lockdown, you don't have the possibility to assemble, to get together with other people. And that was an interesting, also aesthetic part of this protest, to suddenly see this, you know, these huge groups of people, masses on the streets, kind of like occupying the public space again that was completely deserted for weeks. And it's an interesting dynamic between the pandemic and the protests.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, yes, that's really well put. And I'll just say that it's precisely the crisis of legitimacy of the American state in the biggest sense of things that have compelled people to literally put their lives at risk by virtue of this virus. I mean, it is, I mean, again, I'm observing and making a general observation rather than something that pollsters have asked and we have some opinion, public opinion research on. But, you know, one could also speculate that people are also protesting the failure of our government to protect them in a time of a global pandemic. It's like, it's so, yes. I mean, that's what makes this moment such an unprecedented moment for looking at, as one of the questioners said earlier, the fragility of American democracy. It's astounding.
Yes, absolutely. There's another question. It says, what kind of parallels do you observe between blaming the US South for being responsible for racism and post-World War Germans distancing themselves from the actions of the Nazi Party? And I want to extend that a little further, because of course in Germany it also took a lot of time. We sometimes today have the feeling that memory culture was invented in 1945, and of course it wasn't. It was a long and very difficult process, and it was fueled and inspired by American intervention through re-education, but also then in the 1970s, like sort of the big change, and every historian would confirm that, the big change in the German public to think about the Holocaust, to know about the Holocaust, was the series with the TV series with Meryl Streep that was called Holocaust, that really changed everything in the 1970s. It was an American TV series, and that really was super influential. And one might ask, you know, if there was no American intervention, if the world was not forcing Germany to deal with its past, would it have done so? You know, growing up in Austria, which until the early 1990s has seen itself as the first victim of Hitler's aggressive occupation policy, and not as a country of perpetrators, which it actually was, I can confirm that it would have taken a different turn also in Germany. So I would like to extend this question from the audience and ask what kind of public or what kind of global situation America would need maybe to increase the pressure to deal with its history.
Well, that's a powerful question. I mean, I'm going to answer it quickly by way of one thing that produced some of the change that America is backsliding on. So historians have pointed out, for example, that a lot of the energy that came out of the federal government in support of the civil rights movement, some of it started under Eisenhower, in the 1950s. He served 2 terms. So the great war hero of the European theater, in some ways came back home, became president, and essentially recognized that America could not win the Cold War as long as Soviets could weaponize the evidence of anti-Black racism in the United States without giving some ground to Black Americans' claims for actual freedom in this country. That by then was still very much a form of both by law and by custom segregation, akin to what was happening in South Africa under apartheid. So the notion that the presence of a significant foreign enemy putting pressure on the United States in a global contest over the spoils of natural resources and economic interests in other countries and trade relationships. In some ways, since the end of the Cold War, since the 1990s, the United States has not faced the kind of challenge that it had prior to that. And the momentum of social movements, particularly anti-racist ones, have sputtered and stalled. And so there's not a lot of research on this, but there's a lot to think about. And that is, to answer your question, would America need a foreign foe other than Russia right now, which has its own agenda with Trump, which is still a mystery to most people with what is going on between the two of them, to spur the kind of accountability that America has not had to live up to in its global trade relations. In some ways, what I'm suggesting is the old model that I've just given with the Soviets is probably not the best model going forward, but it does suggest that international pressure from very strong, wealthy, large countries, China would be the most obvious example of this, or the European Union in total, could put pressure on the United States by virtue of limiting its trade capacity. I mean, essentially to give America a dose of its own medicine. What played out in the scramble for post-colonial Africa and Latin America was about trade, but played out differently because it was a contest of which country, the Soviets or the Americans, would have more influence over the economic future of those post-colonial parts of the world. So because we're not quite in the same ballpark in that way, things would have to be different. But I do think international pressure of one kind or another from a significant community of interest is the only way to force America to come to a reckoning. The longer version of this would be to re-educate Americans in the way that Germans had to be re-educated. But of course, that takes time.
Maybe we should start with some transatlantic program.
Yes, no, I'm all for
some
it.
Educational program.
I think this is part of that work.
Yes. Oh, I agree. There's a last question, which is a huge question, but you can answer it very briefly, because I think in many ways we've touched upon it throughout this extremely interesting conversation. And it's, of course, a question we all ask ourselves continuously. And it's a question about the strong support, or the still strong support, for Donald Trump after so many scandals, mismanagements, instances of nepotism and international embarrassment, and so on and so forth. You've mentioned before the tensions between science and ignoring science is one of the big issues. The whole idea of fake news. There's so many aspects that lead to this situation, but nonetheless, I want to ask you the question: Is there a short answer to this?
Well, you know what my short answer? You know what my short answer is? To come to your museum, because I don't know if the exhibit I saw in October is still up. That tells the history of propaganda and how it works. So if it is, I encourage everyone to see it, because it is an exhibit that really shows exactly how what Donald Trump has been doing is working the way it was always intended to work, and that many of his staunchest followers are not ignorant, so ignorant as to know that there is a truth or a science behind it, but they don't care. That is not what motivates them. What motivates them is a vision of the future of this country that will be free of elements of our society, of whole groups of people, of spending money on people who are undeserving of taxpayers' dollars. And so you can't win that, that weapon of propaganda with more facts. That is a problem of power, and it is a problem of political manipulation. As long as we assume that people simply just need more information, is as long as this problem will continue to grow and metastasize in this country. People have to see themselves having different interests for different reasons. And I learned a lot from your museum about how to think about the United States of America right now. And so I encourage the questioner to check you out.
Thank you very much. I encourage everybody to tune in to our digital assembly, which follows actually a quote by James Baldwin. The motto is "History is not the past." The quote goes on, it says, "History is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history with us." And I think we all see that right now on many, many levels, in many parts of the world, and especially in the United States, what happens if you ignore history, if you do not talk about it, if you don't incorporate it into the structure of your democracy, and if you do not address trauma, people being hurt, people being isolated for various reasons, people not being heard, people not even having the opportunity to take part into this great American project and the project of democracy at large. And this is, of course, a danger for every state. It's just America that is in the focus right now. But I think the structural problems are the same everywhere, and we have to address them. And I think that was one of the most powerful things about the protests right now, is that they really have arrived in so many places in the world, from Japan to France to Germany, to England and so on, where people were getting together and saying, we have to address this, and we don't have to be against racism, but we have to be anti-racist, and we have to clearly understand what it means. And it's hard, you know, if you're white, it's hard to understand. And I'm not complaining, but it's difficult because you're never in the situation of the people, you know, from every moment of their life, being defined by their race and visible, sort of visibly defined. And I think so. We all have to learn so much, and I would be very happy to continue these conversations, especially these transatlantic conversations. And I'm very grateful to the amerikahaus and the American Academy that they are our partner in this and do such an amazing and great job. And I'm very much looking forward to future events like that. And I thank everybody in the audience who was here. I hope we'll see each other again soon, and not only virtually, but sort of really somewhere, either in the new amerikahaus or in our center, or somewhere in the United States. And this is the moment when the live broadcast ends, and I say goodbye to everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for having me.